So this is the second piece of a 90-minute message that Greg has started last week. I'll continue tonight, and Greg will finish next week. It's about sex, and because of the content of these weekends, it's rated PG-13. That means what we speak of will not be appropriate for young children. However, it will be extremely appropriate for the rest of us. It's ironic, but the subjects of sex and money impact our lives in profound, multifaceted ways, and yet they are taboo, subjects most churches tend to avoid. We'd rather not speak of them. So kudos to Greg, because those are the exact subjects that he'll be highlighting throughout this winter. It's going to be fun, and I hope that you'll make it a priority to join us each weekend. Now, why would we teach about sex? Why would we embrace the awkwardness of that? There are several reasons. Last week, Greg said the main reason is that we want you to have extraordinary relationships. Not typical, but extraordinary. If you're married and you get this part of your relationship right, life will be so much better. And if you aren't married and you get a healthy understanding of this, it could save you from so much regret. We're going to go there to start and to lift up conversations. Conversations between married couples. You may assume that everything's fine in your sex life. That doesn't mean it's so. And it definitely doesn't mean it's all that it could be. God came up with the idea of sex. God is pro-sex. God says sex is to be thoroughly enjoyed in marriage. Not a little bit, a lot. And a conversation between husband and wife could go a long way in that direction. Are you courageous enough to ask your spouse, how could our sex life be better for you? That'd be a great question to ask and then listen, to brace yourself and then listen. Ladies, if you're still wearing the same yellow, dingy nightgown you wore in 2005, that's not great. And husbands, how about you? One woman said at bedtime, my husband bounds out of the bathroom, bare belly and boxer shorts, looking like a beached whale. She said that's about as thrilling as eating prunes. He has all the finesse of a John Deere tractor. It's hard to not be defensive, and it's easier to just avoid conversations. But if we speak with kindness and respect, conversations between spouses about all things sex could be helpful and wonderful. Conversations about all things sex need to take place between singles who are in a relationship with each other, too, because if you're considering marriage in the future, sex will be a big part of that future together. You should talk about sex. This is God's design. We want to be a catalyst for conversations about sex between parents and sons and daughters. On Saturday, January 27, Suncrest will host our first Parents' Brunch. It's going to be an incredible morning for parents, small group leaders, and teachers to connect, to focus on our kids and students and the goal of leading them well in all aspects of their lives. One driving principle that will shape our time that morning is the undeniable truth that you, mom or dad, have an inherent influence that surpasses the influence of anyone here at church or at school. Among other things, that means that you should not delegate the sex conversation to someone else in your child's life. Have you had that conversation with your son or daughter? What's your plan for communicating to your kids all that matters so much surrounding this subject? In Altamont Springs, Florida, there's a park area called Crane's Roost, and that's where I spent half a day with my son Caleb starting this conversation. We walked and we talked together. We found a spot to sit down and we talked some more. And then because he is a processor, because he was wired like that when he was 10 years old and he still is today, we went to lunch. And that gave Caleb more time to think of questions. Now that I know this, what about that, Dad? It also meant that we were eating together, and I have a deep-seated conviction that everything goes better with food. It happened to be outstanding barbecue that day. We started the conversation when he was 10, but it continued. Last year, it was my honor to preside at Caleb and Rachel's wedding, and I can tell you that it has been a privilege to encourage Caleb all along the pathway into marriage. I didn't get everything right as a dad, but I'm thankful for this part. 1 year later, when my son Ben was 9 years old, we went to that same park and we had a similar conversation. It was a half day too, but I remember some of the questions were different, more graphic. We started the conversation a year earlier than with his brother because Ben was more observant, more curious about physical changes. It was the same conversation, but tailor-made for Ben. Now, I'm not here to tell you how to have the conversation with your kids, but moms and dads, have the conversation with your kids. There's a lot at stake. And if you're the one to tell them, and you tell them the truth about sex, they will tend to trust you when it comes to sex and everything else too. We also want to start the conversation about sex between you and God. Whether you're married or single, young or old, would you trust God when it comes to His guidelines for your sex life? Determine in advance that you will pursue God's plans. Psalm 119 verse 9 reads, "How can a young man make his way pure? By living according to your word." How do we know what's right and good and best for us when it comes to sex? Where do those values come from? What's our authority for making decisions in life? Is it popular opinion? Is it friends? Is it kind of vague? I submit to you that the best place to find our values is in conversation with our Creator. Read the Scriptures and pray. Talk with Him. He knows what makes your life work well. He knows you inside and outside. He knows you physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And He loves you. He wants what is absolutely best for you. You can trust Him in all matters, and that includes sex. Last week, Greg talked about lifting the conversation from casual to sacred, and from physical to relational. You know, your marriage relationship and your sex life go together. If one is strong, so is the other. If one is struggling, so is the other. Don't miss the significance of the relational dynamic when it comes to sex. One man was unkind and overbearing to his wife, and he told a friend, "My wife came crawling to me on her hands and knees the other day." His friend, who knew him well, was startled by that, and he said, "Really? She came crawling on her hands and knees. What did she say?" She said, "Come out from under that bed and fight like a man." If you're fighting in your marriage, or even worse, if there's apathy in your marriage, there won't be great sex. Why? Because sex is relational. It's way more than just physical. And it's worth conversations. Here's another reason why we're teaching about sex: to help us all see here and there. Here and there. When you saw the title for today's message, Perversion, you may have thought a couple of things to yourself. First, wow, Greg really gave Dan a hot sermon assignment. Let's be clear, I had that thought as well. It crossed my mind. But here's a second thought that may have come up for you. Perversion, I know what this will be about. You may have assumed this message would be about homosexuality or adultery. Well, both of those subjects do address sexual expressions and sexual behavior outside of God's will for our lives. But that's not where we're going to tonight. It isn't that we lack the courage to speak into those subjects. Greg has taught on both in detail in the past. But for most of us gathered tonight, it would be too easy to hear a message like that and leave here unchanged, maybe reinforced in our notions of church rules, dismissing this time as applying to other people. And so instead, we're going to talk about my perversion and your perversion of God's design for sex. Here's my prayer for tonight: that you will see clearly what right here, where you currently are, is, and that you would be able to imagine here, where God is calling you to a level of experience in your life that is so much better than where you are right now. We're going to talk about lust and pornography and selfishness. So hold on tight. Morgan Freeman is one of my favorite actors. Morgan Freeman once said, "I don't hate and I'm not big on envy, but lust stays with me." And he's right. If we're honest, in our culture today, and because of our physically and emotionally fallen instincts, 90% of us would confess that lust is a factor to some degree. And 10% of us are lying. Did you know the average age that American boys and girls are introduced to online porn is 11? 90% of kids between ages 8 and 18 have viewed porn. 70% of the men in this room right now have recently viewed porn. But pornography isn't just an issue for men. 1 in 3 viewers of porn are now women. And then 100% of those of us currently inside this room battle the sin of selfishness. And because that's true, we are all inclined to pervert God's design and sabotage God's purpose for our lives in our relationships, and that includes our sexual expressions. And so tonight's message isn't for someone else. It isn't for other people. It is for us. Let's start with lust. Lust is a perversion of love. It's a selfish substitute for genuine love for another. Most of us understand that lust is surface, immature, maybe even wrong on some level. But I believe most of us don't really understand what's going on as men and women make their way down this destructive path. One high school student came up to his pastor and said, "Every weekend my girlfriend and I are going too far. We don't have sex, but we go on a date, we find a place to park the car, and we have trouble controlling ourselves." And his pastor said, "Well, the next time you finish your date, you park, take her hand and say, 'Let's just pause and pray together before we lust and disobey God together.'" He said, "Oh, I couldn't do that. It would spoil everything." In a painfully honest moment, the great theologian Augustine once wrote, "Lord, deliver me from lust, but not yet." Lust is so slippery and deceptive. Some of us think it's really just a challenge for teenagers and 20-somethings. Nothing could be further from the truth. Online porn is no longer primarily targeting college students. Older demographics now dominate the market. 16-year-old Joey asked his grandpa, "Grandpa, how old will I have to be for sexual temptation to not be so difficult to resist anymore?" And his grandpa said, "Joey, I wouldn't trust myself until I'd been dead 3 days." Honest grandpa. This is a long quote, but stay with me because it's important. Ernest Becker, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Denial of Death, contends that throughout our lives, a growing consciousness of our own mortality is an increasingly dominant factor in our behavior. Becker says, most of what we do, and especially our sexual behavior, is the result of our vain attempts to suppress the intolerable awareness that we are moving inexorably toward death. He says, our bodies constantly remind us we're getting older. Who among us middle-aged citizens hasn't stood pensively in front of a mirror and viewed with dismay what is, while remembering what has been lost? Our thighs have become flabby, and our hair, if we have any, loses its luster. He says cosmetics can only do so much to counteract biological clocks winding down. And in the midst of the melees brought on by encroaching death, we look for deliverance. Usually we don't care where deliverance comes from, as long as it provides an escape from the pain of knowing what is happening to us. We will accept all forms of lies and distractions if they can make us forget the sinking feeling in the depths of our souls. He says, such is the fertile soil in which lust can be planted and grow. I believe lust, in some ways, is the religion of our culture. Lust has become a substitute for authentic spiritual relationship with God. Instead of investing everything in heaven and eternity, men and women are desperate to regain their past youth. She wonders if, in spite of all that has happened to her over the years, she still possesses seductive powers. There's an excitement in secret emails and messaging, and her escape from reality disregards potential consequences. He tries so hard to be smooth, splashing cash around and acting so awkwardly. He tries to conceal what is obvious to any objective observer. He is a scared little man looking for validation. He thinks it will come if he can hustle women. Younger is better, but any woman will do, even online women. Lust is nurtured by his fears. He wants sex for reasons he doesn't even understand, and the truth is too painful to bear. Do you know that Jesus taught very specifically about lust? Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Actions, behaviors, deeds matter. But Jesus says, even more foundationally, your heart and your mind, your thoughts matter. So lust is a big deal. It matters to God. Lust is the enemy of sexual purity outside of marriage and of sexual faithfulness inside of marriage. Lust is not a young man's sin. It is the sin of men and women of all ages. It's such a powerful temptation that the Scriptures don't just tell us to fight it, but to flee from it. And lust is a perversion of genuine love. It is not the same thing as love. Think of it this way. The Apostle John tells us God is love. He doesn't say God is lust, because they're not the same thing. Pornography is fantasizing about anyone that you are not married to. Porn is thinking explicitly about anyone that you are not married to. This includes using social media to stir up lust. This includes using certain movies to stir up lust. This includes calling back up images from those sources from days, months, or even years prior. Pornography is sin, even if your spouse says he or she is okay with it. Why? Because your pure heart, mind, body, marriage covenant is to God and to your spouse. It is our inclination to justify sin. And surprise, that's also true when it comes to sexual sin. It's what we do. We justify our sin. Let me just say that no one in the history of mankind has had a better marriage because of pornography. That hasn't happened. That isn't the way to spice things up. I'll say it again, God is pro-sex, and as Greg taught last week, one of God's main purposes for sex is to enjoy pleasure in marriage, but that doesn't justify accessing porn. Last month I had an important conversation with a 20-something friend. He is not a follower of Jesus, but he's open to faith. He's trying to figure out what he believes. He told me that one of his New Year's resolutions was that he would not sleep with someone unless he loved her. And that was a big step because a couple of years ago, he had experienced a painful breakup, and it left him with a broken heart, and he had come to realize that ever since that time, that he had used online women and 30 different in-the-flesh women in an effort to feel okay about himself. In that conversation, he recognized and owned that all of that, the porn, the lust, the surface dating relationships, the one-night stands, that it was hurtful to others and to himself. It was destructive. In one word, it was selfish. Ironically, his light bulb moment happened at a Christian wedding where the concept of the covenant was celebrated. But I wonder, could tonight be your light bulb moment? For that to happen in your life, I believe there are 3 lies that you need to recognize and dismiss completely as deception. And to be honest, for all of us, followers of Jesus who are really working at fleeing from lust, and those considering trusting Jesus for the first time or for the first time when it comes to sex, these are the lies that we need to unmask. So here we go. Lie number 1, I'm not hurting anyone. This isn't really a big deal because I'm not hurting anyone. Yes, you are. As Greg said last week, when we objectify people, when we treat people as sexual commodities, it is hurtful and wrong. That's true when we do so in person or by use of images of people. That's true inside marriage, it's true outside marriage. Every person is a person created in the image of God, and the hearts of other people matter. And then our hearts matter. When we objectify others, we progressively break our own hearts. Over time, we can lose our capacity to relate in healthy ways, sexually and otherwise. If you're giving in to lust and porn, you're being changed by those images. You may be oblivious to the influence, but little by little, you're becoming more complacent, more angry, and then numb and apathetic, more selfish, less caring, and less enthusiastic about life. In all kinds of ways, you're checking out of real life bit by bit by bit. And then when we defiantly refuse to follow God's plans for our sex life, we break His heart. As our Father in the heavens, He created sex for our benefit, and He wants us to experience all that He has for us. And we don't when we go our own way, rebelling against His wonderful plans. Lie number 2, I can stop anytime. I can stop anytime. No, you can't. With all addictions, this is the lie that we tell ourselves. Compared to Him, I'm not in that deep. I've got it under control. I can stop anytime. That's a lie. Would you say that with me? Just say it out loud. That's a lie. 1, 2, 3. That's a lie. That's a lie. Lust is potentially more addictive than nicotine or alcohol or cocaine or gambling or even rooting for the Cubs. Destructive things. That's what I'm saying. No. The scriptures just tell it like it is. Listen to James 1:14. Each of you is tempted when you are dragged away by your own evil desire and enticed. And then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death. No matter who you are or which technologies you choose to use to feed your lust, it's going in one direction. Gradually or at lightning speed toward death. Death of a healthy sex life, death of a marriage, death to your capacity to function well at work or in connection with other people, death to healthy emotions, death to your conscience and spiritual sensitivity, maybe even the death of your eternal soul. No matter where you are on the continuum of lust, if you don't get help now, it will be harder to change tomorrow. You're playing with fire. You can't just stop, or you would have already done it. Don't believe that lie. And then the third lie that must be unmasked, and this is huge. It's the lie that says, I can't be forgiven anymore. I can't be forgiven anymore. Maybe today's hit you right between the eyes and your heart is receptive to God, but now the enemy is whispering in your ear, you've crossed a line. You've stepped off the edge of the cliff, and there's no going back. There are sins, and then there are sins. Who do you think you're fooling? Asking for forgiveness? You're damaged goods. If other people find out what you've done, they won't forgive you. And God won't forgive you either. That's a lie. Would you say that one with me? 1, 2, 3. That's a lie. It's not true. Would you listen to these words written about God by a man who totally gave in to lust, broke his marriage vows repeatedly, had a bastard child, lied and murdered to cover it up because he was image conscious, used people right and left over and again, but then came to fear, came to respect God, repented, and turned to God. This is what he wrote. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his love, God's love, for those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, as far away as you can imagine and further, so far has he removed our transgressions from us. As a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. For he knows how we are formed. He remembers that we are dust. I believe that most of us in this room have next steps to take right now. As we leave tonight, in both back corners of this room, there are some amazing people who have experienced some of the pathway that you have been traveling, no matter what that's been, and they want to do whatever they can to help you. You should have a conversation. For some, that conversation's about boundaries. You should get a filter that connects your dangerous internet activity to the emails of two people who care about you. Free accountability software at xxxchurch.com. That resource is at the bottom of your printed program today. Counseling resources are listed there as well, because for some of us, it's about reestablishing trust in healthy ways in our relationships, and we need help to do that. And everyone here, it's about pursuing unselfishness. You know, sex is a great God-given opportunity to learn how to be a giver and not a taker. And then some of us need to offer up some dusty prayers, reconnecting with God after a long time away. Before Marissa comes to sing about God's offer to make you clean, may I lead you in a dusty prayer? Would you pray with me? God, you know, and we know, that we are dust. We're weak. We're frail. We can't do it on our own. And that means we need a Savior. That means we need your power. We need your mercy and your forgiveness. Would you please meet us right now?